Welcome to the Art Against Mental Illness podcast. My name is Alex Lovelace and this is my podcast about the healing powers of art for artists, art lovers, the art curious and anyone with an interest in mental health and well-being. In 1985, Stephen Hawking finally lost his ability to speak. From then on, he communicated verbally via a text-to-speech device called the Equalizer that was attached to his wheelchair and controlled initially by his hand and later by his cheek muscle when he lost the use of his hand. The device spoke in that now iconic robotic American accent, despite the fact that Hawking was English. At various points later in his life, he was given the opportunity to change the voice, but refused, stating he preferred it and identified with it. It's also fair to say that he was instantly recognisable because of that voice. Voices are important in terms of our identity and how we are perceived. Just go ask Morgan Freeman. But voices come in many forms, not just the noises that come out of our mouth hole. Hawking was intensely creative and was responsible for some of the most important discoveries in science, yet he was profoundly disabled. However, he stated, "My disabilities have not been a hindrance. They have shaped my life and made me who I am." In every possible sense, his disabilities were part of his voice and everything he became. He was a one-off, but then we all are. Humans have very different personalities, different lives, different lifestyles, physiologies, worldviews, upbringings, cultures, prejudices, beliefs, and therefore they tend to have different tastes. Even people from roughly the same background and worldview may have some overlapping tastes, but still quite divergent, often radically so. And therefore, the idea that you can make a piece of art that is universally liked is ludicrous. It's just not possible. This is all awesome, and as it should be, because if everyone likes anything that anyone makes, the world would be a boring place, and no progress would ever happen. There would be little or no novelty, and beauty wouldn't exist. Culture emerges through variety, and variety isn't distributed uniformly through culture. In statistics, you have a concept of the normal distribution, often referred to as the bell curve. This is when you take measurements across a population and create a chart that shows how many people have each measurement, the measurement being along the x-axis. Google it, you'll recognise the distinctive bell shape. The obvious example is adult heights. You have a small number of very short people, and the same for very tall people, in between all the heights of the everyday folk around you. This makes a bell shape, with the average height being bang in the middle. What this tells us is the majority of people cluster around a relatively small number of heights. The same goes for shoe size, IQ, and any number of other measures. This is a basic statistical reality, a fact of the universe. There's all sorts out there, but mostly, if you zoom out and look at them en masse, people are pretty similar. This goes for culture too. There's a huge diversity of creative outputs out there. Go poke around Spotify and you'll find an insane number of artists and mind-boggling array of styles and genres. However, despite the quality of their music, cosmic progressive death metal band Blood Incantation are not selling out 10 shows at Wembley Stadium, whereas Taylor Swift is. Go figure. I can recommend the new Blood Incantation album. It's really rather good. I've not heard the new Swift album though. I'm sure she'll get over it. Like Human Heights, there is a middle ground of stuff that's more common and ubiquitous. Stuff that's considered to be more socially and culturally desirable sees more exposure and therefore more engagement than the esoteric stuff. This is just simple statistics. Where there is variance, there is both uniformity and extremes. These days, there are 8 billion people on the surface of this little wet rock we call Earth, most of which are perpetually wired into this thing called the internet, where they spend their time swapping cultures and really mixing things up. So now we have legions of English-speaking teenage girls worshipping Korean boy bands that sing in a language that they themselves don't speak. This is all marvellous. Along with the prevalent or popular culture wherever you find yourself, there are a million microcultures that are like a gumbo with ingredients from across the cultural spectrum. These are cooked up as all different flavours of weirdo seek each other out and celebrate their shared oddity. And these little or sometimes huge cliques sprout new sub-cliques, which then sprout their own tendrils and so on. As I say, marvellous. As we discover more things, more technology, more about the human mind, more about the universe and the world around us, new inputs come in, new people have new ability to create even more strange new things and form cultures around them. So for anyone looking to scratch a cultural itch, there's a hell of a lot of it out there to choose from now. The flip side to this from the point of view of the creator is that on one hand there's 8 billion potential eyeballs. On the other hand, those eyeballs are bombarded with diverse and manifold choices for things that they can consume. And therefore it's quite hard to reach your potential audience, especially since the arrival of things like social networks, Instagram particularly, but now TikTok, YouTube, Netflix and so on. Increasingly, these businesses are mediating what people see. This has a countering effect on the diversification of culture, since these networks have algorithms that are optimized to make money for their owners, and therefore will favor one creator over another in the competition for eyeballs and attention in such ways to maximize revenues. This tends to favour creators and influencers that are already very popular and squeeze out niche players, so the majority of people are exposed to only a small sliver of the global melange. Unless you're lucky enough to be able and inclined to make stuff that pleases the algorithms and therefore the middle ground, you need to seek out your audience, your clique. So not only do you not have to please everyone, you just need to find your tribe and please them. It's not exactly easy to do this, but it is, thanks to the interwebs, possible. And when you find them, they will support you. How do you please them though, perhaps even before you find them? Easy, please yourself, since by definition you are one of them. Actually, it's kind of hard to make stuff that doesn't please you, since how do you know if you've produced something good? You like it. This is not a facetious point and perhaps not as obvious as it seems. From an observer's perspective, ideas and creations are magic unicorn poo that flows from some mystical esoteric inspiration gland using the creator merely as a conduit. But here's how it actually works. You pick a starting point and maybe an end point, or a sense of an end point. You do some stuff to move you away from your starting point and towards your end point. You pause and consider what you've done and make a value judgment. That value judgment is always, do I like where this is going? Is this moving towards my ideal endpoint in a way that I find pleasing? You come up with an answer and either carry on as you were or make the requisite adjustments and then continue. You then repeat this process until you either reach your desired endpoint or you judge that making further changes would make you like it less. That's it. No unicorns in sight. How quickly you get from A to B and how much effort it takes is largely dictated by how difficult your endpoint is to achieve and how much skill you have in your medium. And assuming you like the finished product, you're likely to decide to repeat the whole process again, perhaps with some adjustments based on what you learned from the last one. How do you choose your start and end point? You find something you like and you try to emulate that, and ideally add a flourish of your own. By this measure, creation is always a labour of love. Over time, by repeating this process, you start to create things that are different enough from your initial inspirations that they are completely new, both to you and the world. Your outputs are different from other artists, maybe just a little bit or maybe by a lot. The way that you are distinct from others is called your voice. Sometimes it's called style, but it's more than that. It's about how you choose your subject, which medium and materials you use, and how you wield them, size, shape, colour, textures, word choice, phrasing, where you choose to display it, when. Take the works of Banksy. They're not particularly technically difficult. The compositions are simplistic, if beautifully and impactfully stylised. Really though, the point isn't the designs themselves. In 2005, Banksy created a series of murals on the West Bank wall that divides Israel from the Palestinian territories within, that depict, among other things, holes in the wall, revealing photorealistic, idyllic landscapes in front of which children play, as well as his iconic silhouette of a girl being lifted by a cluster of balloons. He was making a statement about what that wall represents, and one that was only impactful because of where he put them. My point is, in terms of Banksy's voice, it's the where and the why that really counts here as much as the what. American avant-garde composer and performance artist Lamont Young, generally thought of as the father of minimalism, composed long, like 6 hours long, hyper-sparse musical pieces for various instruments in the 1960s. These he played during lengthy live performances accompanied by light shows. He's credited with inspiring David Bowie in the Velvet Underground, among others, and collaborated with John Cale, a member of the latter. I'll point you towards some of his recordings if there were any. Well, there are a few, and I mean a few. Even the scores are hard to come by. This isn't an accident. Young largely refused to allow his performances to be recorded or released, and keeps his scores under wraps, while also frequently changing them. He takes legal action against anyone who tries to perform or make his work available in any way. Young's work is aggressively situational. I'm afraid you just had to be there. So the major component of his voice is when, and arguably, for sanity's sake, how bloody long? At the other end of the scale in terms of musical extremity, in 1986, Brummie grindcore legends Napalm Death recorded a track called You Suffer, which comprised of a blast of chaotic drums and distorted guitars accompanied by the shouted lyrics, "You suffer, but why?" and is exactly 1.316 seconds long. The track holds a world record for the shortest song, and Rolling Stone ranked the song at number 72 on their 100 Greatest Heavy Metal Songs of All Time list. Napalm Death at some points would play the track 30 times in a row live, just for a laugh, and still taunt audiences with it today by playing it unannounced and then berating the audience for not keeping up. Their voice was channeling "What if," or maybe, as stated on the song's Wikipedia page, "Wouldn't it be funny if?" Yoko Ono's 1964 performance artwork cut piece involved her kneeling on a stage in Tokyo and inviting the audience to come and cut bits of her clothes off. This was before she married one of the most famous humans of all time, John Lennon, with whom she later participated in an artwork come protest where they spent 2 weeks in a hotel bed and invited folks to come and view them. There's quite a lot to be extrapolated from Ono's work, but she very much traded in the who. Another of Ono's works I absolutely love is one of her so-called instruction pieces, which are created for the viewer to perform. Many of these are distributed via books like 1964's Grapefruit, which contains 200 such pieces. The one I really love, called Lightning Piece, is simply an instruction. Light a match and watch it till it goes out. Lighting a match and watching it is a sensory delight for all the senses, and it's so fleeting and beautiful. The piece is a Zen-inspired reminder to take some time to experience the simple, beautiful things. Via this and similar pieces, her voice is expressed by who, in this case you, what, where and when, and includes components of smell, touch and even pain if you happen to be holding the match when it reaches its conclusion. My point is not that you should become an abstract performance artist, although if that's what your inner artist is telling you, then crack on. My point is that artistic voice can manifest in an essentially infinite number of ways, many of which transcend simple materials, instruments, subjects, etc. And if you are to be able to free your true artistic self, then you need to allow yourself to be free to do that voodoo that you do. Your voice only expresses what you are as a creator. It differentiates you from other creators and gives a reason for people to like your stuff more or less than someone else's. It's arguable that the voice is art. And this is more important than simply a matter of being original. If you want to grab the attention of audiences that are awash with other voices trying to grab it, then you need to have a distinctive voice. And that voice is something that comes from deep inside you and is not something that can be taught from reading books or by emulating someone else. That might help you hone your technique and your craftsmanship and your mastery, but it's really only paving to the path to more interesting places. Your voice is like your fingerprint, your handwriting, the pattern of your iris. It's something that's individual to you. It's part of your makeup, of your genetics and your upbringing, your culture and so on. It's the essence of you projected onto the real world via an object or a song or a video game or whatever. This all seems a bit abstract and mystical, especially if you're just starting out and you haven't found your voice yet or even figured out what it means to do so. It's not even very easy to define in concrete terms, let alone tell you how to find it. But I can perhaps help you figure out where to look for it. You know when you're listening to your voice, when you're expressing what your inner voice wants to express because you're pleased with what you create, because it gives you joy to experience it, it gives you joy to make it. The journey of finding your voice is really a matter of getting to the point where your ability and craftsmanship matches the needs and the wants of your voice. And this process never really ends. The most experienced creators are usually still chasing that elusive voice. It's part of the fun and the challenge of the process. And as you change as a person, as you get older, as you acquire more experiences and ingest other worldviews and meet new people, as you appreciate new art forms and new approaches and so on, your work continues to evolve, and sometimes you need to learn new tricks to keep up with it. But this often clashes with reality and the culture and society around you. Your voice can move in and out of phase with the ever-mutating cultural environment. This is often apparent with niche musical artists that appear to sell out. This is when they change or compromise their sound or style to suit current musical trends. Their loyal fans might rebel, and it's usually perceived as an artist chasing the money, but perhaps they're just well attuned to the zeitgeist. The flip side is artists that disappear completely when they don't keep up with trends. In this case, they purely listen to their artistic voice and only do things that really please them, or stick with what they do best. Culture moves on and they don't. Sometimes if they stick around long enough, culture comes back around again. An obvious example of this is Aussie rock stalwarts AC/DC, who seem to have survived through multiple instances of such a cycle, having barely changed their signature sound from day one. However, if you've been successful, the pressure to change, both cultural and financial, perhaps from your record label or even your fans, is huge, and doing so without compromising your voice is tricky. I'm getting off track. You get the point. Your voice exists both independently but is affected by and is part of the culture around you. I can't tell you how to find your own voice, but maybe I can help you understand how to hear that voice and how not to drown it out. I've talked about flow before. It's a state of mind you get into when you're totally absorbed by an activity and the world seems to fall away. It's a similar state to meditation, and it's a state that most creators spend their whole time chasing. Flow is what happens when your skills are in line with your ambitions or goals. Voice is what emerges when your output matches the complex mesh of desires that you have in your head. These two work in tandem as you evolve as a creator. Flow happens when you get out of the way of your subconscious. Voice in turn naturally emerges when you do so. You can only really achieve flow when your mastery is of a sufficient level to achieve what your voice desires. Therefore, you need to practice to achieve either. One of the biggest barriers to finding your voice is distinguishing between your voice and the voice of other creators that you admire and wish to emulate. It might be hard to recognise your own voice since, from an artistic perspective, our voice is made up of a patchwork of environmental, cultural and genetic influences, and the cultural aspect of that involves other people's work. We seek to emulate our heroes, which is natural and healthy. That's how art propagates and progresses. If you start to create, it's usually because you've encountered some work that you love so much that you feel compelled to emulate it. So inevitably your work starts out somewhat derivative or even outright copying, at least to the degree that you're able. You don't have a lot of choice about this. You like what you like. There's no shame in this at all. You have to start somewhere after all. Your influences will remain a part of the fingerprint of your voice long after you've moved on. But to be taken seriously as a creator, you must progress and differentiate. The problem with emulating someone else is that you are not them. Your voice is not theirs. The results will always be unsatisfying to produce and will ultimately come up short. It may seem like your influence's voice is the same as yours, but it never is. Most creators figure out this pretty quickly because it often feels more natural and comfortable to let their own voice emerge. Flow states cannot emerge when you're constantly falling short of your desired outcome, which will usually be the case when you emulate someone else's work. You're simply not them. You're not speaking in their voice. You're merely suppressing your own voice in your attempt to channel theirs. This is sometimes hard to recognise, but for many creators, doing so is that aha moment where they finally feel like they've clicked with their chosen art form or medium. This is not something that happens overnight. Your voice will start to leak out in small drips as you progress. Ultimately, having a stronger grasp on your medium gives you the confidence to experiment and push boundaries, giving you more freedom to depart from your beloved roots, like a child gaining independence from her parents. That same confidence allows you the conviction to share your work with others, thus gaining further validation and agency to experiment more. As you spread your wings, you discover more influences, ideas, approaches, techniques, and incorporate them either consciously or subconsciously into your work. You've not left your old world behind, it's still there, it's just been expanded to incorporate new things. So by increments, some larger than others, your work evolves. This is simply a process of your voice emerging and evolving. Maybe this is via refinement within a particular style or movement, further towards a pinnacle of craftsmanship and mastery. Maybe this involves one or more radical shifts and wild diversification. Maybe it's a bit of both. Either way, you progress in increments and probably won't even notice, and then one day you look back at all your older works and realise how far you've come. In my experience, artists tend to start off with a fairly narrow band of influences and are fairly conservative in their development, but then broaden out to experiment with other styles, mediums and subjects before finding their groove and largely sticking to it after that, maybe with a slower evolution and the odd digression. After all, it might well be that your chosen starting point wasn't actually a good fit for your voice, just a reflection of the ideas and approaches you'd been exposed to that point. This is likely the case with those who start young and simply have less life experience. In this sense, the progression is much a correction as an evolution. My own journey as a creator started with a desire to be a fantasy artist and emulate the likes of fantasy art legend Boris Vallejo. I've been through many iterations since then. I'm not even much of a fantasy genre fan and never really was, but echoes of it remain in much of my work to date, and I still massively admire his work, even if I no longer seek to emulate it. And to be fair, I don't think I would be able to if I tried. I'm just not configured that way. How did I get from Swords and Dragons to where I am now? I just followed my voice, which means I did things that pleased me and gave me satisfaction to do so. The little artist in my head became the big artist IRL, and given how restless and prolific I am, my evolutions are usually pretty frequent and pretty obvious, to me at least. Some would say that as you progress, your work becomes more sophisticated and more mature, but I think this view is very limited and a little condescending. I think the pressure to grow as a creator often comes at the expense of satisfaction and fulfillment. Why make freeform jazz when you love electro-punk? Why make abstract expressionism when you love comics? Sophistication is a facet of a style or a medium, not something intrinsic and universal, and beauty is in the eye of the beholder. After all, what's more simplistic than Mark Rothko's colour-filled paintings? In some worlds, that's considered the height of sophistication. I would rate Alan Moore's genre-defining graphic superhero novel Watchmen higher than classics by Hardy or F. Scott Fitzgerald, both in terms of artistic merit and social observation. We develop sophistication and maturity within our medium, and we look to please those who love what we love. And that brings us back to where we started. You can't please everyone. So if you please yourself, your inner voice, you will find an audience who that also pleases. And those who don't like or are indifferent to your work are simply not your audience. The criticisms are no more valid to you than a food critic having views on veterinary science. They are different domains. You don't take your dog to the vet and tell them how to treat it. That's not to say that you should not listen to or accept criticism of the constructive type that comes from your contemporaries or your audience. But you should be sure to mediate and contextualize that criticism, since if you try to cater for everyone within a domain, you'll end up with something derivative that fails to please anyone. Protect your voice, but listen for signals within the noise for how to let more of your voice shine. Of course, pleasing people isn't the only goal of creation. Some people produce art specifically to annoy certain groups, and sometimes all people. It's the case with many artists that the only disappointing response to their work is indifference. If someone despises your work, then you've had a serious impact in their world. You've got them emoting, you've got them thinking and talking about you. You're creeping around in their head, leaving grimy footprints and handprints everywhere. Some artists exist specifically to do this. Some are just douchebags. So even if thus far you've found very few people out there that like your work, if you like it, then there will be others that do too. They might be hard to find, but at least with modern technology it's possible. I'll talk another day about how this is actually getting harder again, but there could be a huge audience out there for your work. You just haven't stumbled across them yet. I know I certainly haven't. And don't think that because you haven't found your audience yet that this means your work is unlovable. You presumably haven't shown it to everyone in the world, so you don't know that. And maybe your style isn't fashionable now, but just as existing styles fall out of fashion, others become trendy. This is as true with art as it is with fashion. You may choose to tweak your approach to better adhere with current trends, but don't risk compromising your voice trying to keep up with the Joneses. My wretchedly hopeful mantra these days is just keep turning up. It's a bit like the whole build it and they will come thing. I think that if I just keep pushing my work in people's faces, they'll eventually take pity on me and buy something. Or maybe I'm just ahead of my time. I guess we'll find out. So although your job as an artist is to honour your voice, that doesn't mean you can't tailor your output for the broadest possible audience. It's perhaps a slightly slippery slope if you let this go too far and get caught in a commercial rut, especially if you find some success. But ultimately, if you like producing work that's more commercial and it honours your voice as much as the non-commercial work, then good for you. Fill your boots. What many creators do is try to get the best of both worlds, produce both commercial work and personal work. This works well as long as you can balance the competing time pressures and that your commercial work can pay the bills. This is a dilemma and trade-off that many that rely on art as their income have to face, and it can be a heartbreaking one. If, like me, you view your art primarily as a therapeutic outlet, it's especially tricky. I need money, but I also need my mental health if I'm going to make money. Perhaps I could make more money if I sacrificed my creative freedom, but would I also be sacrificing some of the therapeutic value? I'll come back to the joys of making money from art or not another day, but it's hard to talk about voice without mentioning it, since it has a disproportionate effect on it. It's just something you have to deal with if you choose to take your craft that far. So in summary, as an artist or as a creator, your job is to find your voice, and it's important for you and your well-being and progression and satisfaction as a creator, but it's also essential from an outward-facing perspective for you to differentiate yourself. Now, for some tips on finding your voice. First, you've got to set aside time just to create as mindfully as possible and to follow your nose, as it were, and work on things that you want to work on from day one. Second, spend some time bathing in your influences and try and figure out what it is about them that really draws you to them. What is the essence of their voice? When trying to emulate and honour them, how does your own voice channel theirs? Third, try not to judge yourself too harshly and recognise when you're judging yourself by someone else's standards. Figure out where your own standards lie and what good looks like for you. If it feels right, it probably is right. Fourth, understand where your core capabilities, your strengths and weaknesses lie. Work with the tools that you've got. Physical, psychological, economic, environmental. If you find that you struggle to emulate someone else's craft, find your own way to the same ends. These boundaries are not weaknesses or limitations, just resistance. Skills meander like rivers do. Fifth, find beauty in your own work by trusting yourself. Let your voice emerge by getting out of its way. Finding your voice is as much about blocking other people's voices. It's as much about not listening to critics, of not judging yourself by yardsticks of culture or society, and to trust your own instincts, and to trust that your work will connect with people. And if you can do that all the while keeping your sanity, then you'll be a force to be reckoned with. But one way or another, your voice will only come when you stop shutting it down and just let it flow. I'll leave you with some words from some folks that are much more articulate and erudite than me. In their book Art and Fear, one of my favourite books on the practice of art, David Bale and Ted Orland explore the inner world of the artist and tackle many of the issues, both philosophical and practical, that I touch upon in this episode and many others. It's a book that I will most likely return to again. Here's what they had to say on the subject of voice. The artistic evidence for the constancy of interior issues is everywhere. It shows in the way most artists return to the same 2 or 3 stories again and again. It shows in the palette of Van Gogh, the characters of Hemingway, the orchestration of your favourite composer. We tell the stories that we have to tell, stories of the things that draw us in. And why should any of us have more than a handful of those? The only work really worth doing, the only work that you can do convincingly, is the work that focuses on the things you care about. To not focus on those issues is to deny the constants in your life. Thanks again for listening, folks. As per usual, if you like this, then hit the subscribe button and tell some other folks about it. Support me on Patreon at patreon.com/AlexLovelace. I now have some NFTs available to buy. I'm on OpenSea at opensea.io/AlexLovelace. I will no doubt have something to say on NFTs, blockchains and crypto at some point. Watch this space. I shall return soon, plus after my mental illness implodes sojourn, I'm back on the party bus, so I have a backlog of drafts for future episodes, so you should hear from me a bit more frequently. I create these episodes when a particular subject tickles my pickles, so you'll just have to turn up and see what happens next. Bye!